Taylor Heinicke, DeAngelo Malone, Kyle Hinton, which players are on the bubble and who will fill those last few spots as today we project the Falcons 53-man roster.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Everyone to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, guys, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've, of course, been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong in this illustrious podcast. And I think each one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast that goes strong with me each and every day, because you make this illustrious podcast your first listen or first watch each and every day. And if you want to become an everydayer, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we have a champion and a self-described everydayer as our guest in Cory Woodroof, as his prize for being the champion of the Falcons Historian Player Shootout. Spoiler alert if you didn't check out those episodes, as we had the finales last week with Matt Ryan of our summer-long trivia tournament. And Cory did emerge victorious to hoist the trophy. And, you know, trophy is non-existent. Basically, his prize was to come on this podcast and nerd out about the roster. And that's exactly what we're going to do on today's episode. We are going to nerd out about the roster. Cory and I will be sharing our 53-man roster projections for the Falcons. We're recording this midday Monday. And so hopefully this will age well, because the Falcons will not do the thing that they often do, which is just wait a couple of hours till after I record a podcast to make roster moves and completely throw out this entire conversation. So we will see if that is the case. And hopefully we'll just wait till Tuesday morning to make your cuts. That's all we're asking here for the Atlanta Falcons. But we will break down Cory and I's differences on offense, defense, special teams, as well as talk about some 20 players that Cory has his eyes on for waiver wire. I already talked about like 5 or 6 guys on yesterday's episode, so we'll piggyback on that. But jumping right into it, Cory, you sent me your 53-man roster projection before we recorded, and 52 of the 53 guys are basically the same. We only differ on one guy on the roster that is on the offensive side of the ball. We'll get to the defense and special teams later on today's episode, but starting with the offense, both Cory and I have the Falcons with I believe 24 on their offense, 3 quarterbacks, Kirk Cousins, Michael Penix, Taylor Heinicke, 4 running backs, and Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, Avery Williams, Jace McClellan. The same 6 receivers in Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod, Kadero Hodge, Casey Washington, and Chris Blair. Same 3 tight ends in Kyle Pitts, Charlie Warner, and Ross Dwelly. And 7 of the same 8 offensive linemen. Those 7 are Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Drew Dahlman, Chris Lindstrom, Caleb McGarry, Storm Norton, Ryan Nuzzel. And that last spot, the one difference we have is Andrew Stueber is on your 53-man roster as that 8th offensive lineman. I have Kyle Hinton on there. We'll start the conversation there, Cory. Why did you go with Stueber over Kyle Hinton?
To make sure this episode wasn't boring. That was just like telepathy. I knew I had to get something. When I was doing my projection, backup offensive lineman is probably the spot that is the most challenging, because it could genuinely be one of like 3 players, I think, between Stueber, Hinton, and Javon Gwynn. I don't think there's necessarily a great like kind of difference of talent between those 3. I think that, I look at versatility necessarily as opposed to kind of like the overall play. Like, I think it's probably a wash between those guys. I'll be honest, I'm not sure that the player that we're going to be talking about right now is even on the roster, because it wouldn't shock me if they go outside the building to look for somebody who can man 1 or 2 of these kind of backup spots outside of Norton and Nizl. But, I think with Stueber, it's just his versatility. He can play right tackle. He can play guard. He's kind of young enough to where you can still argue that there's still something there that you can work with. And I think that with Hinton, they know him and they know who he is. He probably is just who he is now. And that's like, if you want to make an upside argument, you can say Stueber might have a little bit more to grow into. And then, like, the example I always go back to is when the Falcons lost both their starting tackles and they got so bad with depth that, like, Levine Toilolo was playing right tackle during a game against the Vikings. I think it's 2014. And it was just one of those moments where you realize that, like, it really helps to have at least one guy on your reserve who can play tackle and guard. And I think Stueber can give you that. The one thing that I think both of us could be wrong on is that Jovan Gwynn played every single snap in the last 2 preseason games. Like, he was like getting a complete game stretch in both of those contests. And I do wonder, I don't know if it's just because he's a draft pick and they just really wanted to key in on, like, okay, we have this guy, we want to give him every opportunity just to show what he can do. It's not to say it was particularly spectacular. I thought it was fine. I mean, it's just like they blended together. And I think that's a problem when you evaluate backup offensive line talent, is that they can kind of tend to blend together. And I don't think that's a good thing when they do. I think you want to see at least a little bit of pop from one of those guys. I think that Stueber gives you something at tackle, and I think that that's helpful. And the fact that I think they had him running first team reps during camp one day at right tackle, which goes to show that they really must value his versatility. But then again, like, I don't think that they value any 3 of these guys so much that they wouldn't go outside their building to get somebody else.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. My personal opinion is I would like them to go and get someone outside their building, because I wasn't particularly impressed with Stueber, Hinton, or Jovan Gwynn in the event that any one of those guys would, presumably have to start a game at guard like we saw Kyle Hinton do last year when Chris Lindstrom was out. To me, does not fill me with a ton of confidence based off of what I saw this preseason. But I think your logic is sound and reasonable. Stueber's versatility, I thought he looked better as a guard, but the last 2 games playing a lot more tackle was a little iffy. Granted, he was going up against a higher level of competition.
Trayvon Walker has his lunch.
Yes, and I forgot. I think it was Ojabo in the Ravens game that also had sort of turned around. But point that out and you say, yeah, but these are starters. But it's like, if you have to play in an NFL game in the regular season, that's the caliber of players that you have to block. And so that does give me a little bit of pause. So I agree with you there. So we'll see what the Falcons do at that position. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit at the end about some offensive linemen that you have your eye on that could potentially take that spot. But let's talk a little bit about that QB3 spot. That feels like the one spot that everybody's sort of being like, is Taylor Heinicke going to be on this roster, or the Falcons going to have a different option at QB3? They obviously cut John Paddock yesterday in that regard. So I'm curious, how much thought did you have to sort of go back and forth on keeping Taylor Heinicke on this roster, or was this like, he's going to be that 3rd quarterback? There's no questions asked.
It's tough. But the one thing that I keep going back to is when they reworked his deal in the spring, regardless of whether they had Penix in mind or not for a draft pick, they basically gave him like $3 million in like an escape hatch if they ended up cutting him, because no matter what happens, he's got $3 million roughly or so in dead cap. The team will only save about $1 million if they do trade him, cut him, however that goes. Let me see. Over the cap right now projects that Heinicke is on the books right now for $3.3 million about in dead cap, 1.2 in cap savings, and even in a trade situation that doesn't change. So there's really no financial incentive to cut him. It's just because, like, Terry Fontenot has been very adamant on not wanting to assume dead cap during his tenure, and that's a lot of money to lose on a guy who will be active on game day regardless. And I think that's why it's very possible they keep him, is because, like, a lot of the guys we're talking about are very possible inactives and very likely inactives on game day. If Taylor Heinicke can play, or he's on the roster, he can be active, obviously, with that emergency 53 rule. So it's like, I don't think that from a football sense, it makes a ton of sense to keep him, outside of, the fact that if Heinicke gets hurt and they don't want to play Penix, even though I think that with the way that the competitive spirit is going, Penix is your best option to win games over Heinicke. But logistically speaking, he will assume a lot of dead cap money if they trade him or cut him. They're not going to save much. It's like $1 million, which I know this time of year helps, but if you're debating whether you're going to keep like a ninth offensive lineman or a third quarterback, I imagine a guy that they really seem to like, a guy that knows the building, a guy that can continue to be a buffer in that quarterback room between Penix and Cousins. And again, their dynamic seems fine. There doesn't seem to be any problems now. But again, if the Falcons get off to a slow start, Cousins starts getting nervous because he's not playing as well as you want him to, and he's kind of taking some time to get back from his injury. Heinicke's your buffer. Heinicke's the guy that's going to continue to be there, and the team can point to being like, well, don't necessarily assume this and this and this because we have this veteran quarterback on the roster. So I think if a team wants him and they send the Falcons even a 6th or 7th pick, I don't think that they would be against trading him. But I remember the Mike Garafolo report that came out right before Friday's preseason game, basically saying the Falcons don't really have much incentive to cut him, that they're not opposed to keeping him. So I would probably make the decision to let him go just because I would rather have some other spot on the roster where I could keep a young guy and let them develop or have somebody else for depth. But I'm just not sure that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's kind of my sense. But at the same time, if you can get some value for him in trade, that to me is worthwhile, even if it is a conditional 7th round pick in 2026 or something like that, which is the lowest possible trade value you can get. And so to me, if you're the Falcons, whether you think it's an 8% chance that someone's going to call in for Taylor Heinicke or an 80% chance at some point, whatever that percentage is, to me is more valuable with him on the roster than, the $1.2 million that you would get from freeing up. So that to me is the main reason why I think he will be around, and we'll see. I just think the Falcons will keep him, to hopefully trade him at a later date, that someone's going to come call in.
Well, that's what's interesting is if injury strikes, his value goes up.
Yeah.
Because if there's a team that's really struggling to just find somebody, the Falcons can wave him out there. So I think that keeping him will make more sense because they might be able to get a better trade pick from a team that's more desperate.
Yeah. So I think that's the main reason why I will continue to have Taylor Heinicke as that QB3, even though I think a lot of people point out where it's why is he here? What is it that he is really doing other than just vibes in the QB room, as you say, being that buffer to Kirk, so that Kirk, when he looks over his shoulder, he's not staring at Michael Penix and his do-rag in the face at that point in time. So we will continue the conversation, flipping the script to the defensive side of the ball, talk a little bit about why Cory doesn't have DeAngelo Malone, the Falcons' 3rd round pick from the 2022 draft, on his 53-man roster projection. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, you've heard me talk quite a bit about FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, but now I'm here to talk to you about something a little different that they are offering now through September 22nd. All FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. And then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game. And all you need to do so is have a Google account, current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. And while you're there, go check out the lines for the Falcons against the Steelers in week 1. Go check out the line for Georgia to win it all in the national title. Go check it out for your beloved Atlanta Hawks to make it back to the playoffs this year. It's all part of FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So here with Cory Woodroof, who covers the NFL for the Win, a part of USA Today Sports. And we're talking about the Falcons' 53-man roster projection. And for those that want to hear, Cory and I basically have the same 26 players on the 53-man roster for the Falcons defense. So we'll go through those. Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Zach Harrison, Kentavious Street, Eddie Goldman, Taquan Graham, Ruka Roro, and Brandon Dorlus are the 8 defensive linemen. The 4 edge rushers are Matthew Judon, Lorenzo Carter, Arnold Ebiketie, and James Smith-Williams. The 4 linebackers are Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson, Nate Landman, and J.D. Bertrand. The 6 cornerbacks are A.J. Terrell, Mike Hughes, D. Alford, Clark Phillips, Antonio Hamilton, and Kevin King. 4 safeties are Jesse Bates, Justin Simmons, Richie Grant, and Micah Abernathy. And Cory makes the note that I have made also that Abernathy will stick on the roster over DeMarcco Hellams, assuming that DeMarcco Hellams goes on short-term IR to start the year. And then the 3 special teams players are Young Waku, Bradley Pinion, and Liam McCullough. So, Cory, the one player that to me is notably absent, and this was a player that until this past weekend I had on my 3-man roster projection, but coming out of this Jaguars game, I too had to kind of drop him from the roster, and that was DeAngelo Malone, the Falcons' 3rd-round pick from 2022, who's been a standout special teams player, but hasn't necessarily moved the needle in terms of what he's contributed on defense over the last 2 seasons. I'm curious, at what point did you sort of be like, I don't know if DeAngelo Malone is going to stick on this roster?
It's tough. I think that you have to weigh 2 things with him. One, the special teams ability is there. He is probably one of the team's better special teams players. But the flip side of that is he going to be active on game day to provide those snaps, right? And to me, the best justification to make him active on game day is if you're comfortable with him taking defensive snaps. Because at the end of the day, like, there's got to be 7 guys that don't play, and you can take 2 of those from the practice squad. But right now, it is really difficult to find those inactive guys. And I think Malone would be inactive every week. I don't think there's any reason to put him on the field defensively unless you still feel like there's a lot there that hasn't been tapped into yet. He hasn't really shown in the preseason that necessarily right now that's where he is. And again, that's going against lesser competition for most of the part. So it's like, if he's not getting pressure on, ex reserve offensive linemen, is he going to be able to do it against the Trent Williams of the world on game day? And I think right now the answer is no. It's tough losing a draft pick. It's tough, but again, this regime has shown that it's willing to cut bait with guys, that it's not going to do kind of the Thomas Dimitroff thing of kind of letting guys percolate a little longer than they should because of their draft status. So I really feel like that it's a regime change. The coaches right now are not the guys that drafted him. I don't know whether he'll get claimed on waivers or not. So it's very possible he'll end up coming back to Atlanta on the practice squad. I think that's a very plausible scenario, but it wouldn't surprise me, again, if a team picked him up because of his special teams ability, a team that has less depth at offensive, outside linebacker that the Falcons do. So it's tough, but he's never really found his place in the lineup. And I think that the last couple of years, especially when the Falcons have not had too much on the pass rush side, if you can't make that, I don't know if you can make this group that looks improved.
He literally was the one guy that I sat here debating the hardest. And I basically did what you're alluding to, where it's just like, I think he has a role on special teams, but who are you going to put on the inactive list that to basically allow him to play special teams each and every Sunday, as you said? Basically, yes, he has that plus special teams value, but if I'm projecting right now who I think is going to be on the 48-man roster, which is usually my process to building these 53-man rosters, like who's going to be the 48, and then you figure out the last 5. He wasn't in that top 48. And it was just like, okay, this is a nice stash to have for special teams, but there's probably other guys that can contribute more on offense or defense in addition to what they can do on special teams that I think you're going to potentially keep over him. Now, let's talk a little bit about the safety position and the decision involving potentially DeMarcco Hellams. Again, it seems like you're assuming, like I am assuming, that he is not going to start out the year on the 53-man roster. I should clarify a point I made last week on the episode with Mark Raimondi. I was assuming that the rules hadn't changed in regards to how final cuts work with the short-term IR, right? In the previous years, in order to put a player on short-term IR at the beginning of the season, you had to have that guy on the roster, on your 53-man roster through cuts. So basically on Wednesday, the final cuts are Tuesday. Wednesday, you could cut that player or put them on IR and they would go for the short-term IR. They changed that rule this year. And the reason why I didn't know that is because when they made the rule changes, everybody was complaining about the hip drop tackle. And it was really like this rule change. That was the more important thing that, should have mattered a lot more than, hip drop tackles. But that's a rant for another day. But so basically you now have the option of designating 2 players that you've already put on IR, up to 2 players for short-term IR at the beginning of the season. There's now a rule in terms of there's a cap on how many players you can bring back from short-term IR. There's 8 during the regular season. If you make the playoffs, you get 2 more. And these 2 players do count towards your initial 8. So it is possible for the Falcons to put a player like, say, Rondale Moore, who's already on IR. In the previous years, if you go on IR before final cuts, you're done for the year. But there is now the rule that you can bring that guy back now. And, that's what makes the decision to not put Hellams on IR up to this point interesting, because, maybe the Falcons didn't get the memo. I don't know. But all that to explain it, what were your thought process in terms of DeMarcco Hellams in that last safety spot?
I think under the old rules, I would have looked at it as they carry 5 safeties. They carry 5 cornerbacks. They cut Kevin King. And then once they make the maneuver, they bring Kevin King back since there's no risk of losing him to waivers. And then they put Hellams on IR. But my kind of look at the roster, since that's not necessarily the case this year, isn't too much different because, Natrone Brooks is probably the guy they're probably racking their brains hardest on, like, are we going to keep him? Are we going to not? I think that his coverage liabilities kind of came out during the Jaguars game, and that makes it tough because Kevin King seems to be better positioned to step up into a starting outside role if something goes wrong. Natrone Brooks is probably the guy I wanted to keep the most when I was making my 53-man roster, just because I think that Ravens game is kind of like you said, it was rare. Like, we don't often see that from a Falcons defensive back in the preseason. He played really, really well. Then he kind of came down to earth a little bit during the Jaguars game, not majorly, but enough to where it's like you were looking at Kevin King flying around, making plays. Like, there's probably I think, and again, they're not going to probably say this, I think there's probably going to be more of a conversation at cornerback too as the season goes on. It's the one thing where it feels weird that Mike Hughes, that's like the word of the fall, weird. It feels weird that Mike Hughes is just kind of has that job and there's really no discussion on it. So it wouldn't surprise me if, like, later in the season, they're kind of like, maybe we should try Antonio Hamilton here. Oh, what about Clark Phillips? Oh, Kevin King, he's done this before. Like, again, so that's kind of the conversation in my mind when I think about, like, who are they going to keep, who are they going to not have. But safety wise, I mean, Micah Abernathy plays special teams, and that's a guy you can have active on game day because he can give you something on the field at corner. Or at safety, maybe at corner, who knows? It's a big world for defensive backs, but that's to me why, like, a guy like DeAngelo Malone gets cut and a guy like Micah Abernathy stays. But the downside of that is probably going to be, letting a guy like Natrone Brooks go, who I think probably gets picked up off waivers. I think that's just one of those guys that has the potential to just be completely gone because of what he showed in the preseason game.
Certainly, I think the case can be made that, there seems to be a lot of agreement when you look at everybody's 53-man roster projections that have come out over the last week, right? It's just the last 2 or 3 spots. Like, do you have Kevin King? Do you have DeAngelo Malone? Do you have Taylor Heinicke? Do you have Kyle Hinton, sort of thing, for those last 2 or 3 spots? But what is going to potentially blow things up for a lot of these roster projections is if the Falcons are very active off the waiver wire to bring in more guys. We've seen them typically in the past years, like, get 1 guy or something like that, maybe 2. But, because of the recent moves with Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons, I think a lot of people are expecting maybe a little bit more proactivity on the waiver wire. And with that in mind, we'll talk about 20 players, right? Corey's got a big list, 20 guys that Corey has his eyes on off the waiver wire as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Here, buddy. Cover. So here with Cory Woodroof for the win, talking about, some players that we're going to have our eyes on off this waiver wire over the next, 24 to 48 hours as, teams are putting in waiver claims. The Falcons usually put in 1 or 2 during this time. We'll see if, they increase that number to 3 or 4 or something like that. But we have a list of 10 players that Cory has on the waiver wire that the Falcons can just put in a waiver claim if they have priority. That's how waivers work, right? Based off of your previous year's record. So the worse you are, the higher the priority in waiver claims. And then we have 10 guys that are veteran players that won't go through waivers, right? And so basically are essentially free agents that are free to sign with whoever wants them at that point in time. So the list of 10 names to keep your eye on, the non-veterans off of waiver wire. Cory has 3 wide receivers: Dayton Wade with the Ravens, Austin Trammell with the Jaguars, Ben Skoranek with the Texans, 2 offensive linemen in Tremaine Ingram with the Saints, and Larry Borum with the Bears. Two outside linebackers from the Rams, Zach Van Valkenburg and O'Shawn Mathis. I believe Mathis has already been cut by the Rams. And three corners in Robert Rochelle with the Packers, Keith Taylor, the Chiefs cornerback, and Sean Jolly, a Rams cornerback. And the veteran players are wide receivers Robert Woods with the Texans, Allen Robinson with the Giants, and Tyler Johnson with the Rams. A tight end, Donald Parham Jr. with the Chargers. Two offensive linemen, Arlington Hambright with the Colts and Latavius Simmons with the Titans. A defensive lineman, I put Jonathan Williams on this graphic. It's Jonah Williams with the Vikings, former Rams. Edge rusher, Casey Toole with the Bills. Outside linebacker, Khaleke Hudson with the Saints. And cornerback, Duke Shelley with the Vikings. And so the one thing that stands out to me, Cory, with this list of players is how many ex-Rams you have on this list. It seems like there's a clear through line where you're putting a lot of players on this list that are familiar with Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake on this defense. You got a couple of other guys that are familiar with some of the assistant coaches like Donald Parham playing for Kevin Kosher with the Chargers last year. But was that basically the through line with this? You're just guys that are potentially going to be cut by other teams that have played with this coaching staff that you'll see this coaching staff picking up.
Yes, that was basically it outside of one player, and that was Dayton Wade. And I put him on there specifically because he smoked one of the Falcons cornerbacks and had that huge touchdown, and he's from Atlanta. They tend to really like guys who are from the area who get to kind of come out for the home team. So that was just one guy where I was kind of like, I kind of wonder if maybe he could be a really good special teams type player, kind of maybe be like a hybrid test run for that Rondale Moore role that they don't seem to have filled yet. But that was basically my line of thinking, is that we want to think about again, John Mechie is going to be the guy that everyone's going to talk about today, now that we know teams are talking about trading for him. And I get wanting those guys, but we very rarely see the team go after those guys, because the biggest problem when you bring in guys off the wave, is they don't know the offensive system. They don't know the defensive system, right? They're not familiar with the coaches. Again, it's easier to do that with a player like Matt Judon, with a player like Justin Simmons, because you know they're going to come in and you know what you're going to get, right? They're so established at this point that it's just really, really hard to kind of counter that with well, they don't know our system, we don't know their culture. But that's way, way, way harder with guys on the waiver, right? You're bringing guys into your building you have no familiarity with, unless you have familiarity with them, right? And I think that's why if the Falcons do make a waiver claim, which I'm thinking maybe one on the offensive line, that's going to be my guess. A guy like Larry Borum, who Ryan Pace drafted when he was with Chicago, who I think would upgrade Storm Norton as being the team's best swing tackle. Now, he did get hurt in the third preseason game, so I don't know necessarily what his availability will be right away, but if the Bears do cut him or they kind of waive him with an injury settlement, that could be a guy that the Falcons bring in, stash, and then bring up as a kind of a better swing tackle than what they've had. The one guy that I'm really curious about is Robert Rochelle. He was one of the very first drafted guys for Raheem Morris when he came in the Rams in 2021. He was there for 2 seasons. And then last year, he was with the Packers and Justin Hood, who's the new secondary coach. So they kind of had a little bit of time together when they brought Rochelle in later in the season. Apparently, he is a very good special teams player. So that would give you the type of play you need from a guy who you're going to bring in off the waiver wire, because more likely than not, you're not going to be bringing in a guy who is not going to be playing special teams. That's going to be a big consideration for whoever they bring in. Because, again, I think that people misconstrue this time of year. Roster predictions are really fun, but if you really want a major player, like you talked about Ernest Jones yesterday, those are not typically the type of guys you get right now. You're getting best case scenario a Taylor Gabriel, right? Who the Falcons picked up off waivers in 2016, came in, ended up being their third receiver. Awesome. But more likely than not, you're looking for guys who can be good insurance, who can be good special teamers, right? Who maybe you can elevate off the practice squad if things go well. Again, the biggest trade I feel like they've made during this time of year was almost a decade ago with Andy Levitree, who came in and was their starting guard. So it's that move was almost 10 years ago, which makes me feel really, really, really old, which is really disturbing in a way. But the Falcons have a lot of guys themselves who they may be well, we prefer the guy we've spent the entire offseason with, the entire preseason with, so it's just there's a lot of expectation setting that gets done this time of year that tends to be unproductive. So I would just say like adjust your expectations, right? Like Arlington Hambright is probably not going to make anybody super excited. Okay, I get it. That's a guy who maybe they'll sign to the practice squad. He was drafted by Ryan Pace.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And as someone who was watching backup offensive linemen last summer, because I was so concerned at that time about the swing tackle position, I did watch Arlington Hambright for the exact same reason, because he was drafted by Ryan Pace. And I was actually impressed with what Arlington Hambright did.
Okay.
So there is one person on this planet that appreciates a good Arlington Hambright mention here, and that is, of course, yours truly. So I appreciate that mention more than you realize, Cory. And I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your insight into this, giving people a couple more nuggets to sort of chew on when it comes to the 53-man roster projection. And so at this point, we wait to see what the Falcons do, and what I will be talking about probably tomorrow and the next day in terms of what they put together from a roster standpoint, sort of what sort of secret transactions they make in order to maneuver certain things, and what waiver claim pickups they have. So there's still plenty more roster conversation coming here on Locked On Falcons. But Cory, before we duck out of here, let the people know where they can get at you if they want to have conversations about this Falcons roster or anything related to the Falcons in the NFL football this year.
Well, one, I'll share just a little bit of good news for both of us, is that nothing broke while we were doing the podcast. I've been kind of looking at Twitter a little bit while we've been talking, and nothing has happened. So that's great, which means the second we get done talking, they're going to trade for CeeDee Lamb or something. It's going to be just something big blockbuster trade that's going to, change the entire team. No, you can check me out at ftw.usatoday.com for the win. Talking about all types of things over there. Please come check us out. Lots and lots and lots of good stuff, especially this time of year. You can follow me on Twitter, Cory Woodroof 47. For all my hot takes that I have about football. I am an everydayer of Locked On Falcons because I need my expectations tempered like everybody else. And Aaron is the great temperer. So temperer, or the great temp. I don't know what the exact phrase is.
Okay. Well, I appreciate Cory trying to get another AKA, and you got the Jolly Green Giant in earlier this offseason, so you were able to add that. But we'll see. We'll workshop that in the background. We'll see if we can get it.
I did do the Jolly Green Giant thing because I said you were like green beans.
You got to eat your vegetables. Yeah.
Okay. So, I kind of was wondering that. Yeah. Right on.
So we'll workshop a couple of names in the background to see if we can add another one to the list of AKAs. But that is going to do it for us, guys. And as Cory said, now that no news is broken while we were doing the podcast, that means 15 minutes after. I still remember like it was yesterday, the time I had Josh Kendall of The Athletic on the podcast to come on and talk about how the Falcons weren't going to make any major moves in free agency. And not 45 minutes later after that conversation, Falcons are going after Deshaun Watson. And it was like, all right, well, that podcast is out the window. So we'll see if we wind up scrapping this episode because of some major move that the Falcons will make. But guys, we're going to continue having a ball here on Locked On Falcons. Appreciate you guys for tuning in. Make sure you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Fantasy Football, as well as your second listens. All you got to do to continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hold on. We've got breaking news. Hold on. This is important. Cooper, who's going to make the roster? Okay, this is big. Cooper the Chocolate Lab has come on. This is his debut on a podcast, okay? Cooper, who's going to make the roster? What do you think? No, Patrick Mahomes is on the Chiefs. He's not coming to the Falcons. I don't think that's possible. That is a possibility. He wants to see Julio Jones come back. He only knows just like the big names. But at the same time, what's up, buddy? Tyler Starr. Okay, I don't think that's happening. Former Falcons draft pick Tyler Starr is probably not coming back to the roster. Okay, I don't think that's going to happen.